Tonight is a big celebration because this is the first time this group has been able to get together. For those of you who've been members for a long time, you know it's our tradition that we try to convene at least formally 2 times a year. And we have 3 objectives when we do that. One is to be able to get together as a community and reconnect. 2, to learn something new and to expand our common knowledge and build our common dialogue as a community. And 3, it's usually to be able to launch the next class that's going to be going to Harvard 100, whether it's the spring and the executive directors, or the fall and the board of directors. But 2020 has treated Harvard 100 just like everyone else and thrown a few curves. So the courses were not held in Cambridge this year, and it didn't seem that there was a reason for us to be able to get together. And so tonight is our effort to be able to convene as a community. And tonight's topic, I think, is a great topic in terms of the care and feeding of our donors. So we're very excited about the discussion and our ability to be able to be together today. So what I would like to do is just give a couple of quick housekeeping details. One, everybody will be on mute because of the size of our group. The chat function has been turned off except for your ability to be able to chat with the group here. And if you have questions or comments, we encourage you to send your comments and questions, and we're going to be gathering those together, and in some cases may be able to feed it back at the end of the panel, or combine it into something that we're going to send to everybody after the event. So feel free to use chat. We encourage you to do it. It'll be our way of being able to communicate in a relatively large group. In addition to that, I was asked to share, and I'm going to take a few minutes to share a little bit of the foundational elements of Harvard 100 and how we came to be. I think there are a couple of different things that are important. For some of you, this has been a 10-year journey. For others, it's new. And for some of the folks here tonight, you're guests. So we wanted to give a little bit of a grounding on the idea of leadership development for social good. It really started with an idea, and Chuck Recor, who many of you know, is not only a world-class wealth advisor, but has also spent a lot of time thinking about how to help people make better decisions. And I think in his own words, he says he helps people improve decisions who are interested, which I think is an interesting qualifier. But he put forward a question, which is, lots of nonprofit organizations ask for donations, but how are those donations used? And are there more effective ways to get greater impact through those donations? And so developed a hypothesis that if we invested in the leadership of nonprofits, maybe that could create greater impact. So the first premise was that effective leadership can make a positive change in our society. So investing at the top of the organization can have a leverage capability. And in the beginning, it was a belief, but we now, through the group of all of us here, can prove that that kind of investment does, in fact, make sense. The second leg of the hypothesis is that effective leadership can be taught and nurtured. And again, I think those of us who have been through the Harvard program would attest to the fact that there are many things that can be learned, and the idea of nurturing is a little bit about the community that we're building with one another. We also, one of the things that Chuck spent a lot of time thinking and talking about and promoting is this idea of impact philanthropy. And this has become, with all of our donors, all of us, no matter the sector that we're working in, people are asking the question, are my dollars being used effectively? And one of the things that at Harvard 100 we're trying to promote is this idea of impact philanthropy. And impact philanthropy basically says we're going to take a portion of the money that we would normally donate, but we want to tie it to a specific outcome. And in this particular case, it means sending local nonprofit leaders to Harvard University to participate in that world-class program of education and to build a common understanding and language. So if we go all the way back, the goal was to establish the Triangle as the most effective nonprofit community in the nation. And I think Chuck would say this was a bit of an experiment at the beginning, but almost 10 years on, the Triangle community is the one that has invested most consistently and most in terms of the number of people who've gone through the program. The idea was to combine the concepts of investing and education along with the idea of measuring the impact. So if the goal was the most effective nonprofit community, and the idea was to invest in the human capital of the leadership that are running the nonprofits, and that's important because nonprofits are dealing with some of the most difficult social issues we as a country face. Then the question is, can there be a double bottom line? Meaning not just investing in the leadership for the specific organizations that are going, but literally building a community of leaders that have a common experience, they share a common language and a common philosophy through their experience of attending Harvard, and can learn to depend and rely on one another in terms of solving problems and issues as we go forward. And that actually has manifested itself in our community in a number of different ways, and it's really been quite impactful. So in simple terms, what is Harvard 100? Community-driven collective of nonprofit leaders that are inspired through both camaraderie and common language and desire. And it's our focus on outputs, it's our focus on outcomes, not outputs, that matter. And anybody who's been through the program understands the difference there. It's also a commitment to pay it forward and to invest in the human capital in terms of solving these issues. And what kind of a Harvard 100 group would we be if we didn't face question zero? What exactly are we trying to accomplish? And we really just seek to improve the Triangle community by investing in our leadership. So that's a little bit about what the organization is. Over the course of nearly 10 years, Harvard 100 is really a true cross-section of the Triangle community. We have over 67 organizations that are represented, and that's over 131 leaders to date. And it's over to the right on this chart, you'll see it's a whole wide swath of different focus areas, from children to disability to environment to housing and homelessness, and lots of organizations under each of those different focus areas. And our hope is to continue to grow and continue to expand the coverage of focus areas that we have. And that's a great transition into the call for nominations. So Harvard is, at the moment, planning on having their courses in spring of 21 for executive directors and for fall for board of directors. So it's a great time to call for nominations. It's important to recognize that we sponsor organizations. It's not about sponsoring specific individuals. And the idea is that if you have an organization that you think would be great and benefit greatly by being a part of the Harvard program, then we should nominate them and see if they can qualify for the program. Organizations do need to qualify. There's a set of criteria that's been established by Harvard, and the criteria are on our website, the harvard100.com website. You can also get it at the Harvard site. And nominating is easy. There's no secret handshake. There's no special requirement. Essentially, any of us can nominate an organization. It's very easy. If you want to nominate an organization and you can self-fund the tuition and transportation, that's awesome. You can go straight to Harvard and fill out the application and see if the acceptance happens. If you go that way, we ask that you let us know at Harvard 100 so that we can include the organization and the people who are attending in our alumni group. If you are asking for funding or partial funding for an organization, that's great too. Just reach out to us at the harvard100.com site under the Contact Us and let us know the organization and why you're interested. And so finally, I would just like to thank you. It's an authentic thank you to every one of you, because the community is about what you've done and the commitment that you have made. We also want to recognize a special thank you to Chuck Recor and Denise Lowe, who provided not only the inspiration and vision, but the true time, nurturing, talent, and importantly, funding to create a lot of bright lights in this community. They are now encouraging us as a community to create our own future and build on what they have started. And so there's a little group of us, Stacy Barfield, Dana Lang, Danny Rosen, and myself, who have volunteered or voluntold that we should stand up this as a club. And we've done that. But we hope that anybody who's here or anybody who is a part of the alumni and interested in helping be a part of the leadership, just reach out and let us know. We'd be delighted. And with that, I hope that that helps set a foundation for what Harvard 100 is. It's now my pleasure to take us to the main event, which is the care and feeding of your donor base. It's my great pleasure to introduce Danny Rosen, who for most of you really doesn't need an introduction. He has been a friend and colleague to many of us on this call. He is the co-founder and co-owner of Brand Fuel, an amazing company dedicated to making things worth remembering, which I think is a great motto. He serves on a variety of boards, not least of which is A Place at the Table. He's an active co-founder of Band Together, which is a nonprofit which has generated more than $10 million and donated that to 18 nonprofits. And they do that through live and now live streaming events. He's a dedicated member of this community. He's a devoted father and husband and all around good guy. So with that, I'll introduce Danny.
All right. Thank you so much, Phil. That's nice, really sweet. Let's get into this. I just want to start by delivering a dose of reality. During the pandemic, some things have changed, and probably a lot of things have not changed. And I think one thing that has not really changed is this reliance on this nonprofit sector to do the hardest work with often less resources right now. So, without the generosity of existing and new donors, many nonprofits will sadly not exist at this time next year. I mean, I think that's the dose of reality. So you're here and we're glad you're here, but right now is the time to listen to each other and share best practices around development, I would say in open source fashion and also in Harvard 100 fashion. So getting into it here, it's my pleasure to facilitate this, what I hope is going to be a feisty discussion a little bit tonight that'll hopefully have your fingers sore from taking notes. But as you come across the great takeaways, again, share them in chat. We're going to pull that all together. Dana's going to share some of those thoughtful things with the entire group. So I'd like to start by welcoming the first panelist, Matt Cronland. Matt describes himself as an optimistic, open-minded skeptic, and he has this gift of listening first, but sharing his opinions later. I need to learn that tip at home, by the way. Matt, we need to talk. His work is focused on personal philanthropy, the study of happiness and family. Matt has earned the CAP designation, which makes Matt a chartered advisor in philanthropy. So welcome, Matt. Next, I'd like to introduce the guy whose LinkedIn reads, an ordinary person who has had extraordinary experiences and opportunities. But as Phil said, we know him as the founder, the creator, and the visionary of this experiment dubbed the Harvard 100. He has been a benefactor, a guide, and a friend to many of us. And he's helped create a brighter light for nonprofit leadership in our community. So welcome, Chuck Recor. So let's just jump into it. Matt, I'm going to start with you. Let's identify for those folks listening who donors are today. And to ensure we are reaching the right folks, can you share some donor demographics with us?
Yes, thank you, Danny, and great to be here. And thanks everybody for joining this evening. So, yeah, I think it's important to know who our donors are. And I think you alluded to, there's really two parts to that question. You have your existing donors, which are obviously critical to your organization. But I think it's also important to recognize that, they're not just a list of names and prior donors. I want all of you to think about those donors, as more than just a list of names. And, are they, people that you really know? Can you collate those names and organize those names in a way that you can specifically target outreach, marketing, and facilitates the best connections with your organization moving forward, particularly in light of the fact that they've already supported your organization. On the other hand, let's look at the donor potential population as a whole. So, in general, It's a very diverse group, all ages, all genders, all ethnicities. In general, the American population gives annually about $2,500, maybe $3,000 a year. But 90% of high net worth Americans give in some form or fashion. And let me define a high net worth individual. Is typically somebody who's earning annual income in excess of $200,000 a year, or has net worth in excess of $1 million. So that specific donor base gives an average of about $30,000 a year, more than 10 times what the average American does. And it's split over an average of 7 different organizations. And interestingly, I think this kind of makes sense, but research will confirm that those that volunteer tend to give more dollars as well. Now separately, I'd like to highlight bequests. Certain organizations specialize in areas of planned giving, major giving, and bequests. Specifically, research shows that bequests most often come from consistent small donors that typically contribute on the order of $100 to $200, maybe $500 a year, but maybe for 5, 10, 20 years. So they're really under the radar. They're just on the list of donors. And then, often surprisingly, when they pass away, there might be a bequest left for the organization. So if I take that a step further and I highlight those high net worth donors, what I find interesting is, although they give 10 to 15 times the average American, more than half of them have no donor strategy, no planned giving strategy. So it's kind of ad hoc. They're piecing it together. Maybe they're donating to people who ask, more prevalently. But the other thing that I find fascinating is that the number one challenge that a high net worth donor faces is identifying the very causes that they wish to support. So they may have questions about what their values are. They may have questions about what organizations support those values, or what organizations in the community are available. So, obviously that's a real concern. And then lastly, I'd highlight that, there's a reasonably large fraction of donors that rely on, philanthropy to engage, the rest of the family or next generation conversations. So I think, there's a lot we can talk about with donors, and I'm sure we're going to come back to it. But in general, that's I'd say a snapshot.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's kind of hard to reach these folks in person right now, as we all know. And I was thinking about this morning, like we're living in this subscription-based model world when you think about like Spotify and Amazon Subscribe and Netflix and Dollar Shave Club and Ipsy. And so there's this opportunity to try and think about digital connection and those asks, those reoccurring asks of all these demographics. It's hard to get them to make significant contributions when you're not able to talk to them. But setting up a reoccurring monthly gift program for donors is kind of an interesting angle in this time of COVID, when we've got to reach that demographic in a very different way. Chuck, let's go to you. I started talking a long time ago about donor love languages. We all have love languages at home with our spouses, significant others. But this idea of like what matters to donors, and let's talk about what nonprofits can actually offer to help donors. So in other words, considering the law of reciprocity. So the law of reciprocity, instead of just getting from a donor, what can nonprofits actually give back to donors?
Well, I guess you got to figure out what they're interested in. As Matt indicated, half of the major donors really haven't figured out what they're interested in. And so, and I remember this specifically, we were doing a book club, if you recall, Phil. And Phil said to me at the break, he said, what's the major reason people give to an organization? And I said, because they're asked. But I mean, if you go to people and say, why do you support that organization? They kind of look at you vaguely, and most of them will say, well, they asked for money and they're doing good things, and that's it. But they're not necessarily aligned entirely with the donor. So the question of why does a donor give you money? Well, certainly in some cases they feel guilty, they're wealthy and they have a lot more money than they need, and they've come to that realization and they say, what can I do in the community that's good? Sometimes they owe the community. They've done some bad things in their growing up time and they want to do a little payback. They're just altruistic, sometimes want immortality. And that is, I want to give you some money, but somehow I want my name to go on forever. And so, you know, rather than treat them like ATMs where you just send them a letter or push a button and hope they send you some checks, particularly for the larger donors, it's very important to sit down and try to figure out where their heads are. I want to step back just a little bit though and put this in context. If you're going to make societal changes, you need two things. You need visionary leaders and you need support and time for that to work out. So they can do their experimentation. Now there are three players in our society. There's the for-profit component, there's the governmental component, and then there's the nonprofit component. The for-profit component is not structured to address social issues. They are structured to have short-term profitability, and that's where their focus is. Consequently, they do not have long runways, right? And people running corporations are, you know, on the quarterly reporting system model, and you miss a couple, 3 quarters, and the question about your livelihood starts to be raised. So you go to the government side. The government are not equipped for visionary thinking or long-term either. They are also on a cycle. It's on an election cycle. So their job is to keep it in the middle of the road and provide services for the community, but not necessarily solutions. And if they get a little too far, a little too visionary and a little too far down the road, they don't get reelected. So what happens is if any social change is going to occur, it's going to come out of the nonprofit sector. Why? Well, because the nonprofit sector is not accountable to anybody else except itself. Well, that's a burden though, because you have to figure out how to hold yourself accountable. And in many cases, nonprofits don't hold themselves accountable. So they do a lot of activity and they feel they're doing a lot of good work, but they're really not getting anything accomplished for the effort. Second part of that is, I'm going to tell you, we are, in this community particularly, we are blessed with an incredible number of very visionary people running nonprofits. But we have to empower them and let them do it. So you have boards out there in some cases that are restrictive. In boards, in some cases, they're totally turn it over to the executive director and say, you tell us what to do, and they don't even know how to help. And that's part of what the whole point of the Harvard 100 was, is to say, look, let's figure out where we can get together and create a safe place where people can talk about creativity, talk about what's working, talk about what's not working, not failing. When you think about failing, it's not about failing. It's about learning. It's about learning because we tried something and it didn't work. So it falls to the nonprofit. Now, the problem then in the nonprofit is, all right, I've got visionary leadership. I don't have a time frame for them. I've got a long, long runway, but I've got to fund it. Got to fund the experiment, and that's where the donor comes in. So I'm going to give you the first takeaway that I think is really, really important here. Stop calling them donors. Call them investors, because they are investing their money in your community and their community. They are investing in your organization in hopes that you come up with a solution that the society needs. Stop calling them donors. If we call them all investors, they'll start to think they're investors, and they are. We call them donors, it's a charity. None of your organizations are charities. These are organizations that are solving problems. That's my opening comment.
Fantastic. I'm gonna probably need a shock collar every time I say donor, but I'll learn. We all will. I think it's a great point. I think it's also just going back to the reciprocity point. Um, Ask a donor how you can help them. Just ask that open-ended question. They may not offer you any response there, but I think that's a sort of a good thought there. And Chuck, some wise words for sure. Thank you. Matt, let's talk about motivating investors during the pandemic right now. What are the kinds of things that nonprofits should be doing to motivate those investors?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think very often we believe that investors are motivated for the tax deductions or the tax benefits, and I think some of that is a rationalization, kind of an excuse to prevent us from thinking or getting to the root of the matter. In fact, it's quite contrary. With all the recent tax law changes, we've seen in the last, 10, 20 years and beyond, philanthropic giving has changed very little. It's about 3% of GDP. It's been stable, yet increasing, in recent years, along with the wealth of our country. Let me pause here and put a little caveat here, specific to your point as far as motivating within the latest environment. So the CARES Act that was passed this year changed some of the charitable giving flexibility. So for those that itemize, in this calendar year alone, the IRS has lifted the restriction of AGI from 60% to 100% of AGI for cash donations only to public charities, not donor advised funds, not private foundations, because they want that money to get deployed immediately, not just some tax strategy and then I'll give it later. So I want to highlight that part there. For those that do not itemize, they've added a $300 line item per person, though not much, but there is something there for those that don't itemize, can now deduct up to $300 per person. And they've also increased the charitable giving allowance for corporate giving from 10% of corporate taxable income, from 10% to 25%. Again, these are just CARES Act changes, just applicable for this year. So I don't provide tax advice, but I would point that out to say that there are specific, timely tax sensitive things that you might need to mention. But beyond that, I'll say that is not the number one reason why investors donate. It's about their personal values. It's about belief in the organization. It's a belief that their gift is going to make a difference. There are other reasons, such as to Chuck's point, they've been asked. In prior years they've given, so they're used to writing a check, and they did it last year, so they'll do it again this year. Sometimes it's just personal satisfaction. It makes me feel good to be able to give to this or multiple organizations. Sometimes it's religious reasons, trying to give back to the community, or even immortality, like Chuck mentioned earlier. But in general, I'd say investors want to do good. They're lost. They don't know what that means. They very often have not been brought up in the nonprofit space. Maybe they spent 30 years, decades building up their own business, have a liquidity event, and now they say, okay, well, now I have the time and the capacity to begin these conversations. What do I do? And they don't have 30 years of experience there. And so my thought is, from a takeaway perspective, is how do you engage those investors in a way that speaks their language? Think like a donor. When you're developing programs, what programs can you develop specific to your donor base, whether that is, the high net worth space or your direct mail campaign. What is an effective way for you to engage your volunteers? And now that's maybe more important than ever, because they can't do the easy one to just come and roll up their sleeves and work. It might need to be virtual, may need to accommodate for physical on location volunteer opportunities. But also, there's a need now, right? So if we don't ask, we're not going to receive. We're not going to receive for the folks that are able to give at a time like this. Very often, they want to, and by asking them gives them the ability to do that. And then very often that might be an entryway into, expanding that commitment with the organization. If you're able to help that investor feel the impact of their gift. As an investor, they're going to expect a simple thank you, right? Hey, thanks, you got my money. But what else can we do for them? Can we get them out for a tour? Can we get their hands dirty? Your volunteers, they can feel the mission. They're there seeing it every day. And very often your donors aren't. And so how can you connect your donors to the mission like you do for your volunteers? And I think it all rolls back into some sort of a customized development plan that you and your organization either should have or need to have. So I'd say if you're not doing that, you're already behind the curve. You need to do it now.
Now, let me jump on two pieces here. Matt is talking about the alignment of values. It's implicit in the story of any organization what its values are. But I rarely see an organization that has its values posted up front on any of their documents or any of their websites. And the assumption is that the donor or the investor can read that and say, oh, I align with those values. I think that's a fallacious assumption. I think all organizations ought to sit down and say, what are our values and how do we live them? And I think that's one of the first things you talk about some potential investor. This is what we believe in. This is how we live it. If you connect on the values, then the dialogue goes forward. But if you're dependent upon them to figure it out, that's dangerous. All right, that's dangerous. They're smart people, I got it, but you have to make sure they understand it step by step. Connect the dots for them. The second, Matt said, is they want to be thanked, and there's an issue of levels of appropriate thanking. All right, and I'm going to tell you a story. It's a great story. A couple of weeks ago, I'm visiting a friend down on the coast who is philanthropic. And we're talking about the COVID-19. And he says to me, well, back in February when this all started, I was thinking about it. And I said, I'm thinking this organization would need some money. He'd never given money to this organization before, never given time to the organization. So he was pretty invisible to them. So he sent him a $10,000 check. Significant. Felt strongly enough, and by the way, got a letter back. Thank you very much, Executive Director. Sent him another check the next month for $10,000. Well, he got a letter again. It's the same letter, different date. That was fine. Third month he did it. He's done it every month since then. $80,000, and he has 8 letters to show for it. And nobody called him. Nobody asked him why. Why are you been never giving us money and suddenly you're giving us money? What is it that you see in us that we'd like to prompt you? I'll tell you that's incredible. But it's easy to understand how it happens. Everybody's so busy day to day, and it's an outlier. And maybe even, and I will tell you, I think sometimes the nonprofit development people are afraid of big donors. They rather talk to the small people because their story resonates. It's easier, but I'm afraid to get in front of somebody who's multi-million. Now, what that organization does not know, and probably will never know, is this individual is a multi-millionaire, recently retired, young. And what he has said to me is, he said, I'm looking for an organization that I can make a significant difference in for the long haul. Think about that. I mean, the guy, it just flies back to what Matt talked about. Half of the people out there, the major donors, haven't figured out yet how they want to approach it.
It's a great story, heavy, and appreciate the transparency there too, around development directors and the having the courage to ask for big money from big sponsors, donors, investors. I like that talk about values alignment, and all that stuff is amazing. I also think there's an opportunity too around family engagement and leadership opportunities, involving investors in these leadership opportunities. Chuck, you know, this laziness has really kind of got me. I think there's this idea around, you know, laziness on the nonprofit side. We need to do a better job of cultivating. And we've got sort of investor fatigue right now. You just mentioned a great story around that laziness, but are there other things that stories you might tell around what is stopping a donor from giving right now? Stories of what not to do?
Well, I don't know, Matt, anything you want to say there?
Well, I think,
You mean, why, what are you asking? Are you asking why they don't participate?
Yeah, why are they not?
Why do
Why are they
you?
stopping? I mean, laziness is certainly one thing. What else is? Why are we ruining relationships with our nonprofit partners? Why are investors not giving right now? Why are they stopping contributing?
I would say this, first off, I don't think they're not giving. I think actually the statistics will tell you that when you're in crisis like this, giving increases a little bit. So in one way, we're not asking, but asking is hat in hand. And I'm trying to get you to think differently about this. It's not about asking, it's about making the case that the investment in your organization pays off for them.
right.
Whether it's in emotional satisfaction, whether it reduces crime, whether it creates an art that they value. You are producing a community product. You are looking for people who believe in it and are willing to fund it. So I don't think, I mean, you know, you just talked about an introduction, talked about Band Together raising $10 million. And people will say to me sometimes, you know, we're all competing for a little bit of money. This community is incredibly wealthy. It's one of the wealthiest communities on the East Coast that I can think of, quite frankly, particularly in the Raleigh area. There's a lot of money. There's a lot more money out there than you think. I've talked to people who are major donors, and they'll say it is difficult to find an organization they want to support because the organization doesn't manifest itself as a functional, sustainable, value added to the community. That's the gap. That's the gap. You are value added, but they don't know it, and you're not articulating it. I'm not trying to beat you up on this, but it's the issue.
Well, I think that's right. How is the investor going to know what you're doing with those funds unless you tell them? How are they going to know that you're carrying through on what their intentions are? They're not going to know whether you have sound business practices or not, or whether you're being good stewards of their funds, their giving, and their resources that they've worked so hard to send your way. You know, and to Chuck's earlier example, you know, what does $80,000 get you other than 8 letters? of thank you. We can't treat our donors as ATMs, and we have to treat them as individuals and what they're trying to accomplish too. And when we do that, then the values and the mission can align, and we can progress together.
That's great.
So most organizations kind of focus, and this is what Phil's point about outputs versus outcomes. Okay, and outputs are how many tons of food we ship. Outcomes are how many people we feed. All right, but organizations tend to try to find things that they can report on, which are outputs. And I don't know where I was going with this idea, so I just lost it. But no, I do. What a major donor and even a small donor would like to see is an organization that's run efficiently, effectively, and is sustainable over the long haul. What we tend to want to show them are the outputs, not the process, or we'll say outputs or the outcomes even. We want to show them that. The real smart ones want to say, is it a sustainable process? How does the organization run in the inside? All right. So we're showing them the wrong things. I will tell you this, here's a challenge to all of you. You should invite major potential investors to your board meeting. Have an open board meeting. Transparency. Now your board isn't going to like it. I'll tell you that right now. Your board's going to say, well, I don't see why we should have those people here. Well, you want to have them there because you want them to see good governance. Now, if the board says we're not ready to show our governance, you got to think what that means. Or you think maybe I don't want people to see my board functioning because it's dysfunctional. And you know what that means. But I will tell you, if you say to your board, the 2 meetings down the road, we're going to invite investors, people who might give us money to sit in seats behind us to listen to how we function. Your board is going to come dressed up. They will act better because they're being watched. It's the Heisenberg principle. Things change when you start to watch them. Okay, and as long as you don't bring in some third-party objective person who potentially can help the organization, and in fact, I would say every board member, you should say to them, during the month that we're going to have an open board meeting, your job is to bring one donor, one investor. Be proud of what you do in the boardroom. Do it so professionally that they walk out and they go, I thought you guys were just about puppy dogs. But what I realize is you've got a really smart operation here that's got longevity. That's when they start to open the checkbook.
That's brilliant. What a great idea. Thank you. Let's move away from cash for a moment, and let's talk about investors contributing other types of things to nonprofits. Chuck, I'll start with you. Any thoughts on beyond cash?
Give me the question again in a different way. Can you rephrase the question, I guess?
Sure. So Matt, you want to answer first? Get Chuck going?
I thought he was asking Alex to read the question again.
Yeah. All right.
Well, I think it's beyond cash, right? I mean, whatever the donor is able to or wants to give, we want to make sure that we find a way to meet that, right? So it can be, volunteer hours, it can be, board service, it can mean, real estate, it can be my business, in my closely held business, I want to sell part of it. My boat, my car. But I think at the same time, we have to be careful that we have a gift acceptance policy, because there are certain things that we may not want. I don't want, timeshares or, certain types of things. So let's not accept all things, but when we do have a donor who wants to give something, even if it's not something that we're ready to receive, then you have that investor taking that initiative, right? So we have to listen. They are trying to support our organization in one way. And maybe that means we don't want their boat, but we can find another way for them to donate. So think of like the traditional endowment idea, right? I mean, we need $100,000 to support this symphony chair that's going to spin off $5,000 a year in perpetuity. Well, that donor may not have that $100,000 today in cash, and so they'd love to give you their boat. But if we sit down and talk with that investor and realize that that's what they're trying to do, well, maybe we can build a way to work with them. Maybe it's, well, they pay every year the endowment, what would be the endowment spend. So maybe they commit to donating $5,000 a year while they're able to do that, with 100,000 bequest at the end that comes and completes that endowment, rather than turning that investor away from saying, we don't want your boat, when we can see that they're trying to give. Maybe it's a philanthropic mortgage. Somebody who can't afford to buy the house today, but is ready to start making payments on it. So let's let them do that in a way that we can come together and advance that mission, and work on it together.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is the issue of engaging the investor, getting them to think about you, getting them to act on your behalf. If you ask them to help you, you have to have something for them to do. I'm going to give you an idea which I think is interesting. I've not seen it done, but it should be done. All right. Why wouldn't your organization get a deck of cards that are like about credit card size? And on the one side, it says, I support whatever the organization is. On the other side, it has your website and your whoever other contact information you wanted. And I would take that card. In fact, I would take 3 of those cards and I would stick them in every single thank you letter I send. And I would say in my thank you letter, thank you for your money, but we really also would like your help. I would like you to give these cards to people you know, to tell them you support us. How simple is that? Now your $25 a year donor, who you're sending a thank you to, becomes leverage. Who knows who they're going to give it to and who's going to pick up the phone and call you? I don't know, but I will tell you, most nonprofits do not have the high visibility they should have. And if you can use your investors to get that visibility, that's a value.
Yeah, that's a great idea. You are full of great ideas, Chuck. Thank you. I wanted to add a comment here. Meg Pomerantz shared around one of her favorite gifts from investors. She says, an introduction to other investors, or an introduction to someone with skills that can be helpful to the organization. Super, super powerful. I also like the idea, Matt, you were talking about, I think, planting seeds right now. Maybe not every investor can give capital, but maybe they can do something else, volunteer hours, so that down the road, once they're more invested and entrenched in the organization, maybe as a volunteer, they can become an investor in the organization. So let's switch to, I've done a lot of fundraising. Most of us on the Zoom have as well. And I have a hard time sometimes getting an investor to go from what I call maybe land to a yes or a no. And a no sometimes it's knowing is NO-ING is better than not knowing, KNOWING. So let's talk about, how do you get these investors to just freaking make a decision to supporting the nonprofit? Matt or Chuck, either one, you want to take that one?
Well, I can start. I think it's okay when you are, showing that you are really an advocate for that investor, and telling them that it's okay to say no. It also speaks to, if they're in maybe land, it's either it's not the right time, it's not the right organization, it's not the right fit, something isn't right. and we haven't engaged or connected or listened well enough with that investor. Maybe we're not hearing, we're not thinking like a donor. There's something else there. So I'd say that's part of it. I think going back to some of our earlier comments around transparency, accountability, I think we need to have an investor engagement plan so that, we're clear with, what an investor gets in return, whether it's, just from the development interaction expectation. Is it, we're going to invite them for tours to see the facility? Is it going to be marketing events, donor networking events to get donors together, to increase some of that advocacy we were talking about? If you have investors spreading, good words and good wishes all around the community with their friends, that's leverage. I think it's, using your whole team to design a support structure for that investor, turning just a transaction into something that's maybe more emotional. But I think it all goes back to the original connection. If there's still a maybe, something's amiss, and if you push, you're just going to get a go away check, right? That, maybe that, here's $5,000. You think, wow, that's great. We got $5,000, but you left the real opportunity on the table. That investor was engaged, but just didn't understand how you were going to be good stewards, with their donation. They don't know how they're going to be able to monitor the impact. Something is amiss, and a $5,000 go away check is not a win.
Yeah, maybe let me give you an observation here. Sometimes, well, first off, getting big money is obviously difficult, but what happens is sometimes is that people want to help an organization, and an organization is not structured even to take the help. And that is that your person that's a planned giving person in your organization also probably wears the hat of short-term development. So if it's an issue of short-term development versus something 20 years down the road, short-term development wins almost all the time, right? And what will happen is, and you just correct me if I'm wrong. So the development person is probably, 23 to 29 years old, looking for their next job. You're asking them to talk to people who are 60 and 70 in the hopes that those people will put them in their will. Okay. And so they have nothing in common at all other than they look like grandchildren. And what happens is just when they start to build a relationship, they take a new job somewhere else. It starts all over again. But that person who is confused, again, because we realize that the big donors really don't know how to participate and they want to, says something like, well, I'd like to help the organization. What should I do? I'd like to do something significant. And because the person's not trained on the organizational side, they say to the person, well, you need to talk to your CPA, you need to talk to your attorney, you need to talk to your financial advisor where the money is. So what you just said is, I want to give you a lot of money, and you just said to me, well, you've got to do all the work. So I start that process. I go to my CPA, and my CPA says, well, why would you do that? You don't need to do it. You could do it at the end of your life. Okay. I go to the attorney says, whatever you want, I will draw up. But I am indifferent. I'm not an advocate either way. You go to the financial advisor who oversees the money, says, no, you don't want to do that because they don't want to lose the money. So they come back and they give you the go away check. It's a $5,000 check instead of a $500,000 check because you asked them to do the work and you didn't realize you were asking them to do the work.
Thanks for the honesty, the raw, the humor in that too. Good stuff, Chuck. I got one more for you that I think you'll appreciate. There are a lot of board members on this call versus people who are staffed at the nonprofit. So I think this is good for them, but also for the staff. Let's talk about board members a bit. We all know that the board members should be invested in the organization and writing a check to support the nonprofit. But what about board members doing development? Should board members be active fundraisers, or is that really just a staff role? And if they should be active in fundraising, how do you activate the board to keep them invested in actually doing that hard work of going out and asking for funds?
Go ahead, man.
There's so much to say here. Bottom line, if your board doesn't support the organization, then it's a hard ask to go to somebody else, right? And say, well, you should make, contributions to the organization. If the board doesn't believe in the organization, then your development is going to reflect that. I think it would make it a lot easier to be able to say that all of our board members give X or participate at such a level. But in fact, it's somewhere around 2/3 of organizations do not have an explicit financial commitment requirement for their board members. That does mean about 1/3 of them do. But my view, and probably Chuck's, is that it needs to be a little more of a give and a get philosophy, right? You either have to give it, and if you're not able to do that, well, maybe you get people in here, who can. You make introductions. By rule, the board oversees development and fundraising, but they have fundraisers who are supposed to develop the fundraising plan, and they're supposed to kind of take a step back. But I think there is something to be said for those board members need to be accountable too, and supporting those organizations, serving them, various different ways to do that.
Yeah, I think boards fall into two categories. There's steering boards and then there's rowing boards. Steering boards point a direction in which we're going. Rowing boards get you there. All right. There's a couple ways you can approach it. One, I think you can, if you have a requirement to raise funds, you can certainly take your fundraising board and make it an advisory board. It's still on your board, but they're off of the statutory board where your decision making is going to participate. The other is, there's a lot of innovative ways to think about this. I mean, one thing you might want to play with, which I think is a very good idea, if you think about it in the structure, the executive director works for the board. The board appoints the executive director, gives them a vision or approves their vision, either way, and supports them. Why wouldn't you say our board responsibility financially is to raise the money to compensate the executive director? That's their goal. Now, you would not pay the executive director if they came up short, but the power to say our board raises money to cover our executive director's compensation, who is our most critical person. And therefore the money you're going to give us to invest in doesn't go to that, our most critical person. We fund that. That's powerful.
That is.
Choose
That's
to
great.
do that.
Yeah, great point. That's a great point. Linda, not only just
I got one more thought.
yeah, go ahead, keep going. Bring it.
You have people who will stay
My
on the
seatbelt
board.
on.
You
Cut us off, Dan.
cut me off at one point. It'll, mute me, and I'll be talking, and no one will hear me. This deals with people who stay on the board forever, who don't do anything to bring any money into the board. It depends on how the board wants to structure it. I would say a person who's on the board for the first year should have some requirement to bring in some money, maybe $1,000. Okay, but if you've been on the board 10 years, I don't expect you to bring $1,000 in. I expect you to bring a lot more money in because you know the organization better. So I could make the case that the expectation from a financial support point of view increases every year with your longevity. This puts the person who's going to sit on the board and do nothing for 10 years, they're paying $10,000, if that's the number. Then you can justify having them on the board. But the person who's been there 10 or 15 years should absolutely be able to raise more money than the person that's been there for 1 year.
Yeah, that's great. So a couple quick points on that too. Lyndon not only says, and I think this is great, the board helps to cultivate donors and staff should steward the relationship. So the relationship of the donor investor needs to be with the organization, not with the individual. That's such a great point. And so I think training board members to hand those relationships off, very important. There's some red flags popping up in my notes here about people who are in the boardroom and maybe aren't able to bring in money, but maybe they can bring in they can't write a check, but they can bring in relationships. But I think sometimes, I know at the table we have a community action board where some of those members actually represent in the boardroom, and they don't have the financial wherewithal, but they're bringing other skill sets into the boardroom, which definitely have equal value to the funds that may be raised. So definitely a green light there. And then one comment I would make there is that a lot of board members don't want to fundraise. They just don't want to do it. It's icky. They love the organization. They're going to sit in the boardroom and do the work and the wisdom, but they're not going to write the check, or they're not going to, or maybe they'll write a check, but they're not going to go out and fundraise. So I've always thought if you could sit down with the board and just offer an open-ended bitch session, let everybody just let it all out and talk about the fundraising concerns they have, why they won't do it, and try and get to the bottom of what their fears and concerns are, and train them up, because those are the folks that really can be the #1 advocates for the organization. Here's a softball for you, Chuck. Let's talk about strategic plans. We know how important it is to get governance, succession planning in order, but let's talk about strategic plans. So assuming a nonprofit has one, nudge, nudge, everybody, should you share your strategic plan with an often discerning investor? And if you should, why?
Better than a softball. This is like a beach ball. I can really knock this one out of the.
All right, do it.
Certainly, a good organization has governance documents and they follow them. It's very critical. The governance documents give some reason to believe that the organization is structured and has sustainability. My sense is that the strategic plan ought to be something that you send to people. Say, look, I want you to read it. I'd like you to comment on it. This requires a well-written strategic plan, which, by the way, is a task worthy of the board's intellect and time. What happens for a lot of boards is they are given things that are meaningless to do, and so they don't do them well. But if you say, look, I want a committee here to write a strategic plan that makes sense, it's doable, it's rational, it's visionary, not boilerplate, very thoughtful stuff. And then the question is, if you look at it and you say, I will sign that and put it in front of anybody as a example of good, thoughtful stewardship, right? For that, if that's the case, you should be leading with your succession plan. You should have your succession plan, not your succession, I'm sorry, your strategic plan, but you should have your succession plan and your strategic plan on your website. You should ask people to critique it. You're running an organization that's transparent. Yeah, I mean, those kind of documents. Okay, so here's another story. Same very wealthy person down the coast was approached recently by an organization to join the board. I think they probably know he's wealthy, but I don't know how much they know about him, but he's very thoughtful. And so he said, I'd be interested to listen. And he said, how about some governance documents to build some confidence level? And I'm not sure if I've got the story right, but there was a question about job descriptions, which, by the way, would include what the expectation is for the board to participate financially. Strategic plan and sustainability plan and crisis management plan and cash management plan. Everything he asked for was delivered promptly and was current. They didn't have to go dig it out of the file and say, well, it'll take us a week to find out. It's somewhere around here. They got the information to him right away. He reviewed it. He thought it was very thoughtful. And he was saying to me, I don't know if I'll join the board, but I will support the organization because it knows what it's doing. So you know where the 10,000 a month might go. Who knows? I don't know. But the point is, the organizational documents are a selling feature. They're a selling point for the organization. You have to have them and you have to pay attention to them. And if they're well written and they're executed well, people will think you've got yourself a sustainable organization. Thank you for the beach ball.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. I'm gonna throw you a curveball now. This is for either you or Matt. This one comes from Marlo Foster.
Curveballs.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Matt. We'll let you start. This one's from Marlo Foster. I think it's a really good question about the insights into the future of giving. Who knows what the world's going to look like when, not if, we come out of this COVID thing. But you know, what's going to change in terms of giving and asking? Will there be a pullback? What are going to be the real challenges here that nonprofits have, and what are the opportunities that maybe come out of this awful, challenging, and also changing time that we're living in right now?
Yeah, so a couple things. We can look back to 2008, 2009, and say, what happened last time? What happened to giving? Giving was surprisingly resilient. The folks that were in a position to give felt that maybe it was all the more important to give, and there were a sizable amount of investors that had been donating and were not able to continue at the prior levels, but they still felt committed to those organizations, and so they gave hours, or they gave differently, and maybe it was advocacy in the community, which I think is oftentimes equally as valuable. And then very shortly thereafter, in 2010, 2011, giving rebounded entirely, and then a lot of those folks that started by hands-on and volunteering were then in a position that they were able to give dollars again. So I think you'd have a little bit more of that and going on. I think what you're seeing also now is the K-shaped recovery, right? You have some organizations are doing better than others. Some folks are certainly increasing wealth disparity in this country. You have some people that are in a different position than others that, with the ask, are certainly willing to give. I would also say that in the last 10 years, we've seen a trend from what was more of a donor-focused giving environment to try and listen to some of the things we talked about earlier today, in that, listening to those investors and what are they trying to accomplish, their loss. And what we're seeing now is that's transitioning into more of a personal giving, more of an integrative approach to try and not only listen to make it donor focused, but how do we maybe combine that focus from just a donor focused into an integrative approach to philanthropy as a whole. So I'll say it's more of a personalized, integrated approach than just making it all about the donor, because now the investors are beginning to see that they're not mutually exclusive. The success of the organization is not independent of meeting the needs of the donor. They're intertwined, and so therefore we have to work together to do it.
That's great.
I think I would add to that, there is a long-term trend that you'll have to deal with, and that is increased government oversight. And this starts all the way back with Enron. The governmental agencies after Enron passed a lot of rules for publicly traded companies. But in those rules, they also had a couple of provisions for nonprofits. One, you may or may not know, every nonprofit has to have a whistleblower policy. Okay. And that was way back in the response to Enron. The second is, you may have noticed this on your 990s, they require you to put director hours. All right. Now, supposedly that came about from the academic world saying we'd like to have that data available. And if the government collects it, that's fine. But when the government collects data, they start to figure out how to use it. All right. And the fact of the matter is, and you all know it, the nonprofit area has very little scrutiny in terms of if you stay under the radar screen, you don't even have to file a 990. Okay. There's no governmental approach to saying what's rational in terms of what you take in versus what you spend out on your projects. Now, the donor or the investor sometimes will say, I'm only going to give somebody where the money I give them goes to the project. But if too much of it goes to overhead, I'm not going to do that. That's short-sighted because you do have to have overhead and you have to grow, invest in your organization. But the point is, people do not have the capacity to evaluate the criminality, if you will, of certain nonprofits. So what will happen ultimately is some nonprofits will scam the country for some big number. And the investor will be saying, I don't have the capacity to check these things out. I want government to protect me from that. So I suspect the trend long-term is that governments will require more and more information from organizations and make it more available in a larger database. And you just have to comply.
Yeah, that's good. So, I mean, I would add, I think we need to diversify our investors a bit. I know there's a stat out there that says that 95% of investor donors are individuals, foundations, and government related, which means only 5% are in the corporate sector. And you talked a little bit about that, Chuck, earlier, but I think we're now living in a more purpose-driven environment and that companies are trying to figure out how to navigate that. And I think nonprofits have an opportunity to help them. So consider more ways to drive more purpose and meaning into their brands by leveraging what you're doing as a nonprofit to help you raise funds, but also maybe create a new donor channel, investor channel, and support the donor in some way through cause marketing efforts. And I think there's some things that are really happening that are exciting right in the world. So I just want to first say thanks to you, Chuck and Matt. Both you guys did a tremendous amount of prep work on this. We're going to follow up with everybody and share some of our notes and some links to some other sources in Harvard 100 fashion. But I want to round the corner here and hand this off to Dana Lang, who was in our first Harvard 100 class back in the early 20s, I think. She's the past board chair of the food bank, and she has been sharing the good word of this group since day one. And I just want to offer up her services to come out to speak to any of your boards about the Harvard 100 program, why leadership development in the nonprofit sector is so important. She's amazing at it. So enlist her. Dana, it's all yours.
She's on mute.
Yeah, you're on mute. There you go.
I'm so loud, I never feel muted at wherever I am. Sorry. I want to thank Chuck and Matt for all they've done. I've been getting the questions that you all have been sending to Stacy, and there are some things that I want to throw out here to you. Phil Higginson suggested a good book on values alignment called Wealth in Families by Charlie Collier. And Phil says it is out of print, but he has several copies and would be willing to lend them to folks if they are interested. So Phil, thank you. We'll include your contact information when we send out the.
It's an excellent book. Excellent.
Well, there you go. Chuck says it's an excellent book too. So you've got two recommendations: Wealth and Families by Charlie Collier.
If it's out of print, it's only because they're starting another edition. I mean, it's probably in the 8th or 10th edition already. It's a wonderful piece. It's not very thick, but very, very packed with information.
And in the world of books, they really don't go away. You can find them used very easily on the internet if you look. Someone will always sell them. Lee Pike brought up an issue about, don't you want your boards to also be inclusive? And some people don't have financial, excuse me, capability. I'm going to go on and talk about this a little bit, just because on all the boards that I've ever worked on and worked with, it was never about an amount. It was never that you had to give a certain amount of money. It was just the fact that you were supporting. And it's not just about your personal giving. It's about your introduction to others who might give, and your invitation to introduce people. That, you know, people that don't like to ask people for money need to be taught that it's not about asking people for money. It's about making friends. And when you are a part of a nonprofit, whether as a board member or working there, the people that are fearful to ask someone for money for their organization is thinking about it in the wrong way. They want to first tell people about their organization and let them know the exciting things and the things that enthrall you about that organization, and start that as the conversation. Because 9 times out of 10, if you can tell a great story about your organization, those people are going to ask you how they can help. So people just need to learn how to tell a good story and share that story, rather than be told you have to go ask someone for money. Other questions? Marty Martin says board members have 3 rules. Board number 1, boards gives every year. Board participates in fundraising every year in many different opportunities to participate in fundraising. Number 3, there are no exceptions and excuses for rules 1 and 2. So if the board members can't live with these 3 rules, move them off or onto an advisory role. Well, as I just said, that it's really about training people how to do it, as opposed to forcing them to do it. Because sometimes someone you have on your board, because they're a great lawyer or a great CPA, or have wonderful skills in HR, you know, you need those skills on your board too. So you don't want to scare off board members by making them think that it's really only about raising money. Just help them learn how to do it. Just making friends.
Let me just add something here, Dana. One of the things an organization should do is they should give your board members business cards for the organization. All right. Anytime I'm on a board, I have a business card from that organization as well as my personal business card. And when I meet somebody, I hand both of them. And I say, this is my vocation, but this is my avocation. And most of the time people will say, tell me more about the avocation. They don't care about my business. They care about the avocation, the thing I'm interested in, what brought you to that, etc. It allows you to bring up the conversation. I mean, otherwise, how do you say, hi, I'm so-and-so, let me tell you about food bank. That's weird as could be. What I want to do is show you I'm involved. And if you want to hear about the food bank, I'm delighted to tell you. So it gives your board an opportunity to introduce the organization without being too forward.
Excellent. Amber Smith wants to know from this group to consider the approach of community-centric fundraising. and weigh in on it. Matt or Chuck, do you have something to say about community-centric fundraising?
Well, I'll say there are, to our earlier question, where is development and investorship headed? Many different directions. There's more choices than there ever were as far as impact investing, venture philanthropy, whether it's the Zuckerberg model, using, for-profit organizations to advance a social agenda. I'd say that lots of different ways to do it, but there's also, something to be said for the grassroots, the local, the community opportunity. I think that's where Harvard 100 shines, right? Because we have the ability to have a shared language and shared experience, a shared community, to leverage the rest of the group, whether it's experiences, techniques, opportunities, research. I think that's extremely powerful. So, we're all trying to serve the same community, and let's leverage the community as a whole to do that, I think is the answer to that.
Good. One more, and then we're running out of time. I need to hand this off to Stacy Barfield. One more, just a note that nonprofits do have to file a 990 and have to do so electronically. And if they miss 3 consecutive years, they lose their tax exempt status. So they can get away with it for a little while, but after a while they can't. So Stacy Barfield, who has been a Harvard 100 participant since a long time back. Stacy, I don't know, I feel like you were in an early class, but she works for Armstrong McGuire, who does great work helping nonprofits, and I'm gonna turn it over to her.
Great. Well, I just want to thank everyone for coming today, for taking time out, especially after 5 o'clock. I'd like to thank Matt and Chuck for their time and their preparation, as well as Danny for preparing, kind of leading those two through a coherent session, because we know that both Chuck, Matt, and Danny, or both Chuck and Matt can they have so much knowledge that there's a lot that they could be saying about these topics. So thanks, Danny, for keeping them on track. And I want to thank Dana, Phil, Danny, and Denise for all the support in putting this together. I just sent out a message asking you for future topic ideas. If you ever want to send a message to the Harvard 100, you can see that info@theharvard100.org email address. Feel free to send that and we get that. And we also put out a poll. It's one question. It's anonymous. We don't know who says what, but if all of you could answer that poll just by hitting the little polls button on Zoom, we'd appreciate it. And finally, our next session is scheduled for January 26th. It will be about succession planning, so stay tuned for that. Just mark your calendars again at 5 o'clock, and you'll be hearing more about it. If I was communicating with a few people whose email addresses I didn't have, I've captured those, so thank you. If you did not send that to me, please take a second to do so. If you got this message forwarded to you, and or you can send your information to info@theharvard100.org. So with that, we're wrapping at 6:29, and really appreciate all your time.
Thank you, everybody.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.